Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the Funky Dope podcast. I am your host today, Dr. Edie Ruiz, and I have a very special guest with me here today, Dr. David Green from Howard University. I will introduce him in just a second, but I just want to say I'm really excited because this is also going to be the first time that we are holding what we call a fireside chat. And it's just a little bit more of an informal kind of conversation that Dr. Green and I will be having about progressive education and the various definitions that are circulating around right now in 2022 about progressive education. Many educators today are claiming to be progressive, but we would like to get into a little discussion of what does that actually mean to be a progressive educator today? So welcome, Dr. Green. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm associate professor of English at Howard University. I work primarily in African American rhetoric and African American literature. I also direct the writing program there, and I'm also secretary of 4Cs, the National Organization College Composition and Communication.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
My interest on hip hop. That was
it. Please tell us more about your hip hop literacy course or anything you want to tell us about the research that you've been doing.
So my research is primarily oriented around theories of writing and writing studies. And this comes out of my understanding of hip hop as a rhetoric or as a cultural rhetoric, and one that is essential to how we may think about our expressive capacities, as well as our theories about how composing works and what is the best way to engage students and others. I'm also deeply interested in, as obviously on here, in progressive pedagogy. I look at it through a liberatory lens, primarily influenced by Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, Keith Gilliard, Victor Villanueva, and a number of other, educators or critical educators who really allow us to think carefully about what it means to not just raise consciousness, but to raise consciousness in a way that allows us to engage each other in ways that foster social justice or foster freedom in any kind of way. My teaching kind of is animated around that. I teach a wide range of classes across literature, rhetoric, writing, and cultural studies and social justice courses as well. And so I teach African American Literary Foundations as one course that I teach. I also teach the African American, what is the word I'm looking for? The rhetoric of African American fiction, and a number of other courses. And most recently, I've been engaging in a course titled Hip Hop Conversations on Social Justice. It's a part of the Social Justice Consortium here at Howard. And so students can take this course. It's a 1-credit course. They can take this course. And we engage weekly in conversations central to hip hop that deal with hip hop, but also reflect on hip hop's attitudes, arguments, and positions on different issues related to social justice and culture.
Wow, that is just amazing. What an awesome research trajectory. And I know there's just so much we could learn from you. And I've been thinking a lot too about the relationship between hip hop literacies and progressive education, especially the history of hip hop. And I could just imagine how dynamic each of these courses that you've mentioned are. And I really particularly wanted to pay attention to the way that you discuss a pedagogical approach that can be defined as progressive, but one that's very much based upon the engagement that occurs in classrooms that concentrate on a critical pedagogical approach, such as you mentioned, associated with bell hooks, Victor Villanueva, Keith Gilliard, etc., Paulo Freire. And I could just only imagine that in your classroom, how this kind of comes alive. But I definitely want to be able to talk a little bit more about progressive education as we start off our discussion. And so here's a little quote from Bell Hooks from her book that I'm sure you're familiar with, Teaching to Transgress: Education and the Practice of Freedom, as you mentioned, education as liberatory practice. And there's this quote here, and she says, she writes, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, and recognizing one another's presence. And I just wanted to just take a minute to ruminate on what that quote actually signifies and how it might challenge maybe some of the more watered down kind of professional definitions of progressive in different types of sectors. What do you have to say about that quote in terms of how you would define a progressive education, or what is unique about it?
I think it puts people first, and that's one of the main things I've always taken away from Bell Hooks, is developing our emotional intelligence alongside our critical kind of approaches and techniques, and using that or employing that to help elevate our students' emotional intelligence as well. But first and foremost, it has to do with recognition. And I think that's partly what guides my own pedagogy, but I think that is central for any classroom. I know and I'm one of the people who argue for some structure, but I also know that in any given situation, in any classroom, a teacher, an instructor, a professor has to have that capacity to be able to recognize at a human level what is happening and what changes may need to happen, how we may need to alter plans, how we may need to adjust our thinking, our critical acumen, and how we approach certain conversations, lessons, et cetera, et cetera. And then on another level, it is about investment. It's about investment in the voices of students and voices of teachers as well, right? So it begins to think about the classroom space itself as, we use the cliche of community, but I think we all have a variety of definitions of community and how that can look. But the central to any definition of community is the interaction amongst others and across others, with an idea towards collective understanding. And so from that quote, I hold it kind of near and dear to my own teaching. I think it's central, to any kind of progressive approach to education, is about student voices. It's about kind of placing student voices at the center. And some ways we can try to do that. It can be through discussion. It can be through certain activities and things of that nature. What I find most interesting is like learning to kind of step back critically and push some of my preconceptions or notions about an idea or a text, push that to the side for a little bit in order to both hear and understand, where students are coming from. This doesn't mean I don't challenge it, I don't say hogwash or push back on some of the things that they say, but it does mean really taking that step. And it gets fun on Zoom, but even in person, really just clicking that mute button and watching them go, hearing some of their different perspectives and where they're coming from and why. And I think that, that's what I get from that quote in that passage. It's just all of that as kind of being central to how we do progressive pedagogy. I know, as you mentioned, some watered down definition. I don't have any watered down examples, but I don't have any one or any examples.
I can help you out with that.
Okay. But I can imagine, like in popular culture, the way it gets taken up is it's any, things that get labeled radical is anything that deviates from a kind of traditional standard approach to education. And so bringing in popular cultural text or bringing in music becomes viewed as becoming progressive, or um, even positioning certain authors or certain conversations as progressive. And I think this is just more of the same from the kind of 80s cultural war, multiculturalism conversation that took place, and a number of people have weighed in on, and most centrally, the decision and the understanding has been representation is simply not enough. So to have people appear on a syllabus, appear on a text is not always simply enough. Um, how are we engaging them, and for what purposes?
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
and how are we using those to engage, either the voices that those texts represent or the communities that they're, trying to speak for.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, but that's not always the case. So, but
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from you. What are the some of those texts out there today? But what was your read of the passage? I'm always interested in dialoguing about it.
Yeah, thank you for asking because I've been reflecting a little bit on the role of pedagogical presence in critical pedagogical approaches or progressive approaches. And especially since, unfortunately, Bell Hooks passed. And I definitely wanted to revisit her book after that occurred. And because it was something that always stuck in my mind, but I was really just struck about how much she expresses the classroom to be an intimate space.
Yeah,
And I really like how you mentioned her people's first approach, because I mean those words just really stand out too, and I'm pretty sure those were words that were actually used in her book, and thinking about people first and thinking about not being afraid to bring in discussions about spiritualism or meditation, or one's practices of how they maintain resiliency, for example. Thinking about the critical space of being a first generation student, thinking about the space between oneself and the classroom and the curriculum, for example, and opening up the space for an educator to be able to provide a sense of safeness for students to be able to engage in those kinds of conversations without feeling judged, while they all are agreeing that there's something that they're trying to learn together. They're trying to ingest together, grow together. And I think that the way that she opens up the classroom as that kind of safe space, but also one within education, is not something that all educators think of. And I think that's what she mentioned, that too, like people don't necessarily go into the classroom being able to feel comfortable and confident that there are at least these other 20 human beings with all of their different backgrounds and histories, that come into play, and through their engagement with the material, not just as a disembodied subject there that is, going back to the Freirean pedagogy, challenging this kind of like, depositing of knowledge, that there's much more dynamism that takes place in the classroom. And I think that it does take someone to really critically and empathetically reflect on their own pedagogy in ways that, for example, somebody claims that progressive education is about being in with the latest like digital technology or the digital techniques and multimodal techniques. And yes, that's definitely progressive. It's moving forward. It's moving toward what we understand as the evolution of education, or the evolution of the mind as it relates to science, technology, etc., in this kind of objective way, or objectifying the body. But what about who the student is? Um, Different kinds of, I don't know, I guess what people would call quote unquote woke types of ideas. And really, what does that mean, without downplaying it, or without reducing the definition, or without saying that to be woke is a snowflake? What does it really mean today? And I think that it really allows us to ask these kinds of questions. And so yeah, there's so much to think about, but
yeah,
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 for
yeah.
sure. So when somebody like says progressive, I'm a progressive educator, and everything.
You could have a wide meaning, right? It's similar to a liberal, right? What kind of liberal are you? What kind of conservative are you? It's such a broad kind of term that folks throw around.
But I
But
want to
you
talk a
know,
little bit about what you said about let's go beyond inclusion, because I have seen a couple of, without mentioning any names, open educational resources floating out there that claim to be inclusive, that claim to be non-traditional, and that claim to be even anti, like an anti-textbook, and to be, it's a progressive educational approach. And I was wondering, because I know that you did mention some kind of watered down, just inclusive measures. But what about those types of claims about being a progressive educator? Any ideas or thoughts about that?
well, I think the proof is in the work that folks do, and again, it becomes about how are we privileging student voices. I mean, the one thing I get from that, going back to that quote again, this idea of voice and presence, is that we're imagining, understanding, engaging, real bodies as we move and decide, which position or which practice is best for students, and ultimately that's what leads us to being progressive, and not necessarily um, there's no any particular simple default cookie cutter approach that we can just kind of displace to make a pedagogy progressive, or to make our engagement with students um, more progressive in that regard. And then I was just thinking about the wideness of the term, even progressive, and really I try to move away from those kinds of terms in how I think about the teaching or the work that we do. In part because I think we can get too bogged down with terms. So that was the sense I'm getting from your words about anti, and I'm thinking about the current craze around anti-racism and kind of anti-patriarchal, or anti, just whatever anti you can kind of throw it against. And at the heart of it, I think we're still doing the same work that has always, been out there, and has always been the work that has needed to be done, um, which is breaking down and developing a full understanding of how white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, sexism, misogyny, how all of these things play out and are normalized in ways that we can't see or aren't always aware of. And I think the important thing for us, either in writing, rhetoric, literature, culture, is that so much of this stuff is embedded into the essays we read, into the fiction novels or poems that we read as well. Either as a form of criticism, or either highlighting ways that we've kind of normalized things, that shouldn't be normalized. For instance, I'm thinking about Jamila Woods' poem "Black Girl Art," right, which is obviously a play off of Mary Baraka's Black Art poem, in which both work to, in ways, personify the toxic and kind of deadly nature of all of these isms and discriminatory practices, and kind of troubling social practices, and really, in Baraka's case, become a bully and kind of push back against it. But in Jamila Woods' case, one thing I found interesting with my students was just like, man, how many ways do we not talk about how women are vulnerable, or how Black women are particularly vulnerable, either growing up
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
moving in the world. And so she has one line where she talks about, I want a poem that basically can turn into a weapon if I have to walk down a dark alley of some sort, or something as kind of protection. And it's like, for my positionality, um, well, as a young kid, and even today, you're always concerned and aware of one's surroundings and the dangers that we're in.
Mhm.
Um, it's not as kind of ever present or as visceral as it is made in that poem, to be something that is on the minds of young women. And I thought that was like a really fruitful moment with my class to have that conversation,
Mhm.
really kind of put pressure on things we tend to normalize or don't speak about, and that folks just, are not aware of. Um, but for me, that's, like, that is my form of response. I think what we teach is always going to shift, or in order of importance. relative to how the labor market has shifted, as well as how different literacies have evolved. And so, what do we need to know about how people are making meaning in order to operate in the world? And then, additionally, what kind of jobs are out there that students are invested in, that folks are interested in, and how is the university kind of framing the offerings that are going to be provided for that? Or not even a university, if we're talking about a community classroom or any kind of classroom, how is it trying to meet certain interest and demand about either a set of skills, practices, or knowledges,
Mm-hmm.
related to particular labor. But that's going to always shift. But the need to put people first, that's I think that's always, always going to be present, and that is for me always going to be the central kind of element of how we think about critical pedagogy. Does this do good for more than it does harm to people? Does it make people more aware of the types of harms that are out there, whether physical, symbolic, or linguistic, however we want to frame that? Um, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we do better? How do we work on ourselves and our abilities and way to do better? As you mentioned, Bill Hooks having that kind of spiritual component, I think that
Mm-hmm.
becomes very important in this day and age. Many of the students that I engage are already thinking about these things: their mental health, their their spiritual health as well, their ability
Mm-hmm.
or freedom to kind of choose and move in those things, in those spaces. And so, it becomes very, very important as teachers to kind of think about how this stuff informs the very work we do, whether it's, mechanical engineering, or American literature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think what a powerful figure, that Bell Hooks is to be able to generate this type of thought. I teach one of her essays. I've taught it many, many times, Keeping Close to Home, Class and
Mm,
Education. And it's such an intimate essay. It's a very intimate, and that Bell Hooks is talking about what it means to be an academic, right, at Stanford,
mm,
and the history behind that, and all of the different challenges that she had to meet, and especially being a first generation academic, somebody that entered into the Ivy League doors against the will of her parents. Like, her parents did not want her to move away from home, and she's like, well, this is kind of how things have to be. And that in addition to having to face that resistance from her parents and kind of just go on off her own, she also has to face this resistance from colleagues, and she faces the resistance from the academy, and so therefore the very resistance to herself, right, like to her, who she is, and her body, and her ability to just assert her humanity. And I feel that
mhm,
it's something that
mhm,
she communicates really well through her writing. It's definitely something that is situated within that context of, I think, that time period too, and thinking about culture wars and thinking about the limitations of multiculturalism. I remember, a quote about that as well, and going beyond just this inclusive type, but also the inclusion of who she is, and the experience that she embodies, and the
mhm,
ways, right, and the ways that she can actually connect to other academics who are trying to negotiate this space, these expectations of family, the very intimate space of family, but also the necessity of like having this career but never wanting to give up one's voice. And the way that she talks about like her home, she says that she carries her home within her wherever she
mhm.
goes, and that very much reminds me of Gloria Anzaldúa, who's also another one of my favorite authors. But it reminds me of that, and that they're both saying like, you carry this home within you, and whatever that means, and all of the contradictions and all of the different ways that that pulls you into a space that's also not safe. Right, the space that it's not necessarily even acknowledging that home that you carry within you, but that yet you never want to give that up. And I think it is a really it's kind of a
Well,
common
it's got trauma attached to it too. That's one
mm-hmm,
of the important things she points out is, like it's present, and there's trauma attached to it, and our feelings about family, about home as well, a conflictedness that has to be resolved, and this is one way to kind of resolve it. You know, is through doing that deep dive work, and trying to understand how it plays out differently for others, um, right? That approach to
Yes.
critical pluralism that she talks about. But then also, in resolving it for ourselves, we become better thinkers. We were able to do the work that we want to do in ways that are much more free. So, right, but that trauma is attached to that home and I know it well, right? That my
Mm-hmm,
story
mm-hmm.
in some ways similar. Um,
Yeah. And you did
because,
mention the idea of emotional intelligence and how much that's actually a journey, right? And it's only a journey that can be opened up, or the possibility of even being able to embark on that journey is only opened up in a space like that Bell Hooks tries to provide, right? A safe space to be able to engage in that journey, to
yeah,
be able to
yeah,
gain a type of emotional intelligence that it's not like, you
mhm,
can go and say, hey, I'm realizing now that I have trauma. Okay, what do I do with that? It's not going to come automatically. It's kind of like
yeah.
this
We're
never.
taught to shut it off, right? We're taught to shut it down. You don't talk about that. Or
Exactly.
in some
Yes.
ways, so
Mm-hmm.
I think that right, that's what she's saying is to create spaces in which people can kind of understand how these things are interconnected, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Understand more about ourselves and trying to understand the work that we're doing together as well.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
it's like we get told even now it's improper. It's becoming more acceptable, but it's improper to talk about one's faith or talk about how one is feeling in relationship to class. Like class is supposed to get started, we got to get to these lessons, and so on and so forth. Um, but I really take that from her, and I really appreciate that kind of mindfulness of slowing down and seeing how people are doing, um, because everyone's got these different stories, and it is important understanding those stories that you understand how to better not just educate but engage. You know, not just provide information for folks to absorb or pick up or keep or
Mm-hmm.
interpret, um, but really create a space in which I see you, I understand what's going on. I can understand at another level what you're trying to say, whether in this paper or through these assignments or even in our conversations with each other.
Yes, definitely, for sure. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how some of the work that you focus on with hip hop literacy, hip hop rhetorics, and African American rhetorics. If you could talk a little bit about how that might be used as a space to be able to open up,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
those types of conversations.
That was one of our conversations today in class, which is really interesting.
Oh.
And we were reading one article about WAP, Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B's song and music video. But one of the speakers within the interview mentioned that, right, this is what hip hop does, or this is what their music does, is it creates a space to begin to engage questions about misogyny or sexism, or even to try to understand how how our attitudes towards Black bodies in public spaces and towards Black female sexuality is something that is constructed and prescribed and has to do with the dis-ease with the breach of etiquette that's at play. But for me, all of hip hop does this, and so I know for a lot of folks, it's like, oh, you study hip hop. How does that, vibe with
Hmm.
what you do, with literature, or in some ways, people don't always see how hip hop may fit within a humanistic frame of study. Um, how it vibes with the classics and with this text and with that text, and the beauty for me is that part of hip hop's most essential element is the synthesis, is the combination and the synthesis. And so that's how we get the remix, and that's how we get the kind of constructed production beats that
Hmm.
occur. That's how we get a lot of really dope songs. It's like the mixture of different artists on there, artists who in one verse can address this audience and these sets of topics, and the next verse take it somewhere very self-reflexive or introspective, or somewhere very spiritual, or very scientific, depending on who the artist is, or how they're writing. But it's that synthesis, it's that ability to weave, blend, compose, try to understand in that way. And I think that's what hip hop provides. it's a space where we got to confront all of this stuff that is a part of American culture, whether we like it or not, the violence, the misogyny, um, the poverty, the systemic racism, the ageism, the kind of predatory lending and loan practices. Like all of this is present. Is present in the stories that hip hop artists tell. It's present in the stories that producers tell about their journeys, present in how people think and move and understand fashion within the culture, right? So really, hip hop is that space for synthesis because it brings all of this stuff up front, and so we have to confront it. And in doing so, we have to develop certain dispositions towards difference and disagreement that I think are productive. It's not just an idea about canceling or silencing or censoring in any kind of way. It's really like, well, you're here, I'm here, and we're not going anywhere, right? We're all a part of the same community. So how do we get along, or how do we make this make sense? Again, the synthesis process, how do we begin to blend or connect our voices, our perspectives in ways that are productive to the larger whole? And so for me, that's what hip hop allows. And so, right, it's just that space to do it. And then there's also these different techniques that people borrow to do it, whether it's crate digging and looking back into the past, whether it's a type of approach to communal conversation through the cipher, or even how people may think about kind of certain critical practices like the playlist or the mixtape, and how people begin to arrange and select the different voices, positions, dispositions that they'll use to characterize, right, where they stand on something or how they understand something. I know it's a long-winded way, but it's like, for me, that's what hip hop provides. It's this confrontation with difference in ways that are productive. Like, we got to figure out how this connects, right? How does this James Brown sample over here connect to this Isley Brothers sample over here, connect to the drums from Fat Albert or whatever other TV show you heard over here. And it's good, but it's got to sound dope. It sounds like a bunch, mixed up garbage or something.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. Thank you so much for your generosity with sharing. I was just thinking and just trying to imagine, how this course would make me think about or challenge traditional notions of rhetoric and the ways that we talk about like arrangement, execution, and just the processes of rhetoric and the ways that talking about rhetoric from a hip hop perspective within all of the different social dynamics, historical dynamics, and cultural movements really challenges those kinds of traditional frameworks, right? And I'm just like thinking about going back to this idea of inclusion. I think, you could say, okay, well, I'm going to include this music or this hip hop music or this hip hop song, for example, NWA. I'm a West Coast person, so NWA on your syllabus, right? Because I was gonna say, are you just only doing East Coast? Or we talk about West Coast here, East Coast? Because I know, I understand that. But say, for example, if I say, okay, I'm going to talk about what people think about, abolition. I'm going to bring in NWA, F the Police. Just for example, that's a song that was played at many of the George Floyd protests, and and for good reason. And I'm just thinking about, like, if I was going to include that on a syllabus but not really talk about the history of the significance of the song, like even within its geopolitical context, something like that. Is that really critical pedagogy? Is that being progressive? Is that challenging or pushing the bar beyond inclusion? Or is that being truly inclusive? And just hearing you talk just made me think about those things, and also the way that a rhetorical theory class might just completely overlook any kind of discussion, right, that deals with all of the many dynamic topics that you were just mentioning as it relates to the art of hip hop, the expression of hip hop. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's part of what hip hop provides for me, and what I tend to advocate as well. I think for us as a discipline, and even much larger, the humanities as an area of study as well. I think we have to begin to rethink these things from the ground up. I agree with you 100%. There needs to be a deep understanding of the context and the history and the legacies that are attached to the text and the ideas that we're teaching. Um, and how we engage that, it can look different, and we can come from a variety of different angles. But there needs to be like a serious understanding of how these texts and ideas begin to connect, because so much has happened, right? So many new texts have been added. I was joking with somebody maybe a month ago. It's like the way anthologies go today, it would be really hard to kind of do some of these foundational anthologies that came out of the 80s and the 90s, even with regard to rhetoric, but also critical study and all these other disciplines and subdisciplines. It's really hard to do that because so much has happened. So many things we've come to understand as important or as attached to it. And so we really have to even rethink the anthology model. You can't just I'm gonna start from this date and I'm gonna give you every text that I think is a classic, or every text that I understand to be a classic moving forward. It's, in some ways it's like, well, how are these texts in conversation across time? And that's one of the things I do with my classes, and even in my thinking about this. And I consider that a hip hop technique. Is really rethinking, either a text or a reading list, from the ground up about what I'm trying to achieve with it and what kind of new understanding I'm trying to cultivate. And I think you may have an NWA text that sits right next to, say, a kind of classical text, Socrates' Apology, right? In a sense, that's partly what he says. If the power structure at play doesn't understand, what I've done to be just, to be correct, to be right? I have to go with my conscience and my ethical conscience and my ethical disposition, and that's partly where F the police comes from. It is a response to state agents or outside forces impinging upon folks' lives in ways that make little sense to them, and also disrespects the kind of community ethic and kind of community code and community etiquette in some places, right? And so it's like a major disruption in that way. But as you mentioned, all of this has to be discussed. It has to be thought out. Like, what is the relationship? Because that's what we're going to be providing students, I think. It's not just the ideas from the text, but how they're in conversation with other ideas. And then we're going to ask them to become DJs of their own in some sort, or rappers, or just critical rhetors in their own fashion, and begin to pick, what they're going to put into the mix, into their mix, into what they're composing for their understanding of the world, of this particular discipline, of this particular concept. So we have to allow them to be fresh. We have to allow them to have their own voices, right? But the best way we can do that is not just thrust down their throats, this text because it's a classic, or it's rooted in this, or it's always done this, but really begin to rethink how all this stuff is connected and what does the best service, for them and their perspective. That's at least how I approach it. It's like, what new ideas are going to come from this combination of thinking, and why? So it's not just a toss anything in there kind of approach. That's not necessarily a hip hop ethic, but it is a kind of searching, understanding, grappling with, and then begin looking for different kind of connections, developing that critical ear, critical eye, that sensibility that's like, this is worth keeping. This is useful in this way. This is helpful in this. This helps me understand people. Help me understand how certain human perspectives come about in the ways that they do. I don't want to over talk it, but yeah.
No, thank you so much. I could just sit here and keep listening to it. Thank you so much for your generosity. I know that the audience will appreciate that so much. I wanted just to talk a little bit more. We're almost out of time here, but I wanted us to talk a little bit about the relationship between, um, just to be very blunt, Black radicalism or Black nationalism and Afrocentrism.
Mm,
And yeah, and those kinds of, ideological movements of nationalism that grew out of the civil rights movement. I wanted us to talk just a little bit because I think, when we're talking about hip hop literacies and the way that, many people say, well, those hip hop literacies, those are born in the streets, or those are, these kind of street rhetorics, or these kinds of like informal, illegitimate types of rhetorics. They're not considered legitimate in the academy. Why should we, endorse these types of literacies or these illegitimate literacies and things like that? And I just wanted to think about that for a little bit, especially because since we're talking about emotional intelligence and thinking about intellectual movements and thinking about, for example, Black intellectual
mm,
life and the
mm,
expression.
mhm.
I don't know. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that, or what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think hip hop is bound up in all of that, and that's why it remains relevant. As Trisha Rose notes, the hip hop wars, hip hop is important to all of those conversations in part because it's the dominant way that we talk about race in the modern era. If we're honest with ourselves, when people are making commentary about certain hip hop artists, they're making comments about a black community or about a particular type of community, whether it's black and brown community. As well. And so, but the commentary and the sentiment is still there. Um, and even the way we kind of understand fashion in that realm or different elements of it in that realm is still racialized in a variety of ways. And
Hmm.
because it's racialized, the actors within hip hop are always grappling with a variety of subjects that are essential to what is in the academy. What is has been traditionally a part of the academy. You can't talk about African American literature without talking about hip hop. Um, you can't talk about African American rhetoric without talking. You can't really talk about, I don't think, Latinx rhetoric without talking about hip hop in some ways. Just because the music and ideas are so central to folks, um, either modern dispositions toward resistance, folks' understanding of cultural expression in a variety of ways.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's
Yes.
important in all those ways, and so in that way, it becomes important to how we think about the conversations. We're placing on kids and we're engaging students with. The other thing is as I've been trying to say is that um, the idea of hip hop is both subject and method, and in some interesting ways. And so
Hmm.
it is a way of thinking about all of this stuff. It is a rhetoric in that sense, right? It is an approach, a series of techniques and practices that can be useful for one who is engaging in kind of critical research or engaging in a variety of expressive activities. And in that way, it becomes vitally important because it's become such a dominant lens for youth
Hmm.
culture in this era. So it's a way folks see the world or understand things. It's predominantly a way I come and engage and attempt to understand things. Even how misogyny works, how I've been complicit in the
Hmm.
practice of either patriarchy or pressing certain misogynistic views. And I think that's where the kind of critical pedagogy comes into play, and it blends with hip hop in that way. Hip hop places it on the table, right? Critical and progressive approaches. Ask ask us, how do we apply some of these old questions to it, to these issues as they arise. And then hip hop comes back around and remixes all of that for us so we can see it from fresh, new perspectives and new lenses, right? You see it through the eyes of a 17-year-old, or we see it through the eyes of a 29-year-old um, who's living either in LA or who's also living in Atlanta, who may be living in New Orleans, right? They're all over the place. And so we're getting these critical dispositions, and given the amount of information overload that has been happening, um, right? I don't think we can any longer persist in this kind of arranged and segmented model of education in which, right? got
Mm-hmm.
British. We have British studies here. We have American studies. And we have African American studies.
Mm-hmm.
And never shall they touch or overlap or we move into each other's territories. um, no, they got to overlap in some ways.
Yes,
In other
definitely.
ways, they're going to diverge. But hip hop becomes a way to understand that overlap and not be fearful of it,
Mm-hmm.
and to also put pressure on some of our biases. And as I mentioned, kind of normalized um, dispositions towards racism or misogyny of any form.
Wow, thank you so much. Yes, so this brings us to the end of our fireside chat, and it's been such a pleasure speaking with you on these topics. I've been wanting to talk with you with these topics for some time now. I'm so glad that we
Yeah,
found the
yeah, we've been
opportunity.
promising, right, to have this convo. I appreciate it. Next
Yes.
time we got to have the real fire there crackling, right?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. It's cold enough right now. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Green, and thank you for to the audience for tuning in. We hope this was educational and engaging in some way. And um, yes, we'll be signing off for episode 2.
Thank you, Dr. Reeves. Hope everybody enjoyed it.
Thank you.